The island of Saipan hides a silence heavier than stone. What could drive mothers to clutch their infants and leap into the sea? What kind of terror could lead entire families to gather inside caves, strike a match, and accept death rather than surrender? Imagine walking into the blackness and finding not soldiers, but children curled in their mothers' arms, their faces frozen in soot and ash. Imagine soldiers, hardened by months of fighting, suddenly breaking down in tears because what they saw was not war at all, it was despair. In Saipan, victory was won, yet it felt like murder. Stay with us, because this is not only the story of a battle. This is the story of how lies can kill more than bullets, how fear can consume an entire island, and how memories of those dark caves still echo through history. The battle for Saipan began on the morning of June 15, 1944, when over 70,000 Marines and soldiers of the United States stormed the beaches. Ahead of them stood Japanese artillery dug into the hills, waiting with machine guns, mortars, and sniper fire. From the very first hour, Saipan felt cursed. Landing craft erupted in flames. Men clung to burning wrecks as the sea turned red around them. Survivors later recalled how the smell of cordite and salt water mixed with human remains made the entire shoreline feel like an open grave. Unlike other islands, Saipan was not empty. It was home to tens of thousands of civilians, families caught in the crossfire of history. Villages were abandoned overnight, women carrying children fled into caves carved into limestone cliffs, and elderly men armed only with bamboo spears stood against tanks. For American soldiers, this was more than combat. It was stepping into a nightmare where every shadow might hide either an ambush or a desperate family. As days stretched into weeks, the battle became more savage. Sugarcane fields turned into killing grounds. Forests of palm trees were reduced to stumps. At night, strange sounds echoed across the hills, sometimes gunfire, sometimes cries that did not belong to soldiers. The Americans pressed forward, but they began to sense that Saipan was different. It was not just a battlefield. It was a place where war and humanity collided in the most tragic way. And as we follow this story deeper into those caves and cliffs, we must ask, was this victory, or was it a scar carved into the soul of mankind? On the morning of June 15, 1944, the sea before Saipan roared with the engines of invasion. Over 700 ships gathered offshore, their decks crowded with men who knew they were about to face fire. In the distance, the island stretched like a dark shape on the horizon, its cliffs rising from the Pacific as if to warn them, "You will not leave unscarred." The first waves of Marines climbed down the cargo nets into landing craft that bobbed and swayed in the surf. Engines sputtered as officers shouted orders above the crashing waves. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the Armada unleashed its fury. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, pounding the shoreline with thousands of shells. Explosions tore through palm groves, sending black smoke spiraling into the sky. The ground shook, but the Japanese defenders endured in their bunkers, waiting. When the landing craft surged toward the beach, the defenders struck. Mortars whistled down from hidden positions, ripping boats apart before they reached the shore. Machine guns spat fire from pillboxes concealed among rocks. Entire squads were cut down before their boots touched sand. Survivors hurled themselves into the shallow surf, struggling to wade through water thick with blood and burning oil. One Marine later wrote that the surf itself seemed alive, writhing with bodies and wreckage. The men pressed forward, dragging themselves past smoking tanks and shattered equipment. They crawled behind dunes, only to find the sand already cratered by artillery. The beach was no shelter. Every step inland was a fight through gunfire, barbed wire, and minefields. And yet, despite the slaughter, the Americans did not stop. Wave after wave, battalions surged ashore, forcing open a foothold at the cost of thousands of lives. What made Saipan different was not only the ferocity of its defenses, but the presence of civilians. Unlike Tarawa or Guadalcanal, Saipan was home to Japanese settlers and local islanders. As Marines advanced, they passed through villages eerily deserted. Houses stood with doors wide open, cooking fires still smoldering, toys abandoned in the dirt. It was as if entire communities had vanished overnight. The truth was far more haunting. They had fled into the caves. For the soldiers, this realization struck like a cold hand on the heart. They were trained to fight soldiers, not to walk through towns emptied of women and children. They found trails leading into the hills, faint footprints that ended at gaping cavern mouths. Black openings in the cliffs seemed to swallow the land itself. Some Marines whispered that the island felt cursed, that Saipan was more than a battlefield. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. The fighting inland was merciless. Sugarcane fields, once green and swaying, became killing grounds. Every ridge and rise concealed machine gun nests. Artillery hidden in caves rained shells without warning. Tanks clawed their way forward, only to be destroyed by suicide squads who hurled explosives under their treads. Civilians were caught in the middle. Women carrying infants ran straight into crossfire. Elderly men attacked tanks with bamboo spears, only to be gunned down in seconds. Soldiers who witnessed these moments admitted it broke something inside them. This was not war as they had known it. This was human tragedy, unfolding step by step. Night brought little relief. Japanese soldiers used the darkness to slip behind American lines, launching sudden ambushes from caves. Marines awoke to screams as grenades exploded among tents. Flares lit the sky, revealing shadows darting across the fields. The Americans fought not only the enemy in front of them, but the fear that death could emerge from any hole in the earth. By the end of the first week, Saipan was already being called a cursed island. Veterans of Guadalcanal and Tarawa admitted they had never seen anything like it. The blend of fierce resistance and the eerie presence of civilians made every day feel like stepping deeper into a nightmare. Soldiers said the island itself seemed to resist them, as if it refused to yield. Yet, despite the horror, the Americans pushed forward. By late June, they had carved their way across villages reduced to ash and fields littered with corpses. Tanks and flamethrowers cleared bunkers one by one, while artillery blasted ridges into rubble. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards, bought with blood at every step. But even as the Americans advanced, something more unsettling began to surface. This was not just a fight against defenders, it was a descent into an island where civilians were vanishing into the earth, where caves hid not only soldiers but entire families. The soldiers did not yet know it, but the true horror of Saipan lay in those dark caverns, waiting for the day when silence would reveal a tragedy too great to bear. The Marines called it progress, but each step inland felt like walking into a grave. The island was alive with echoes, distant gunfire, sudden cries, the dull thud of mortars, and yet it was the silences that unnerved them most. Entire stretches of jungle lay still, only to erupt when hidden defenders struck from beneath the ground. Every tree stump was suspect, every mound of earth a possible ambush. More than once, patrols discovered items that stopped them cold. A child's sandal left in the dirt, a teacup still warm beside a fire, futons hastily abandoned in caves. These were not the signs of soldiers, they were traces of families. To the men, it was as if ghosts walked just ahead of them, always unseen but never far away. Some Marines admitted in their diaries that they began to dread the caves more than the open battlefield. A hill could be stormed, a bunker could be destroyed, but a cave was a mouth that swallowed all certainty. When darkness yawned before them, no man knew if it hid a machine gun nest, a group of soldiers waiting to strike, or families who had sealed themselves inside. By late June, exhaustion and fear mixed into something heavier than fatigue. Survivors remembered that Saipan did not feel like a fight for territory. It felt like stepping into a world where death had already claimed everything, and the living were only walking through its shadow. What none of them yet realized was that the greatest shock still waited ahead. The caves were not only strongholds of resistance, they were to become the stage for the most haunting tragedy of the Pacific. The night of July 6, 1944, was strangely still. After weeks of endless fighting, American soldiers finally believed the island was nearly secured. Fires smoldered across the fields, the rumble of artillery had quieted, and some men dared to sleep without boots on. But in the hills above them, thousands of Japanese soldiers prepared for a final act of fury. At dawn, on July the 7th, the earth itself seemed to scream. Over 3,000 men surged forward in the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. They came with bayonets fixed, rifles clutched, and voices raised in a cry that shook the air. Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor. It was a storm of human desperation, crashing into the American lines with unstoppable force. The first impact struck 2 battalions of the United States Army. Machine guns rattled, mowing down wave after wave, but the charge did not falter. Soldiers who survived described the ground as so slick with blood that their rifles slipped from their hands. Men wrestled in the dirt, bayonets flashing, grenades exploding at point-blank range. One company of the 105th Infantry Regiment was almost annihilated in minutes. Commanders shouted orders drowned by the roar of battle, while medics worked frantically, only to be cut down themselves. Survivors remembered the chaos as a blur of steel and screams, the kind of madness that stripped the soul bare. By the time the sun rose higher in the sky, the charge had burned itself out. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead across the fields, many clutching weapons even in rigor mortis. Their bodies formed a carpet of silence where only hours before they had thundered forward. It was, by every measure, a massacre. But if the ground was quiet, the cliffs and caves above were not. The Banzai charge was not only a final assault, it was a distraction. Hidden in the hills and caverns, countless civilians had been watching, waiting for their fate. Now, with the last organized resistance destroyed, the Americans turned their attention toward the caves. What they discovered was unlike anything they had ever faced. Some caves erupted with gunfire, defenders firing wildly in one last stand. Others remained silent, dark mouths in the stone that refused to reveal what they hid. To enter was to leave daylight behind, stepping into a suffocating darkness where every shadow felt alive. Flamethrower teams advanced first, streams of liquid fire hissing into the caverns. The roar filled the tunnels like a furnace, smoke pouring out as flames consumed bedding, ammunition, and bodies alike. When the fire died down, soldiers crept inside, flashlights trembling in their hands. What they found broke them. The first chambers held bodies charred beyond recognition, twisted in unnatural poses, their flesh melted into the blackened rock. Helmets cracked from the heat, rifles warped and useless. The smell clung to the men's skin, seeping into their uniforms, a stench they swore never left them. Deeper still, they discovered something worse. Families. Mothers bound infants to their backs, elders slumped against walls, hands folded as if in prayer. Fathers sat with grenades still clenched between their fingers, faces locked in agony. Some had died by poison, others by fire, still others by explosions they set themselves. These were not soldiers, they were civilians consumed by terror. The realization hit like a wound. For weeks, propaganda had told Japanese islanders that Americans were demons who would torture and slaughter them. Now, standing in the smoke-filled chambers, the Marines saw the consequence of that lie. It was not only the dead that haunted them, but the silence of hundreds of voices stilled by fear. Many veterans later admitted they began to dread cave clearing more than open battle. In firefights, death came fast and furious. In the caves, death lingered. It sat heavy on the air. It clung to the stones. It echoed in the cries of survivors too weak to flee. One Marine wrote in his diary, "In these caves, victory feels like murder." The Banzai charge had been terrifying, but what followed it was far worse. For as the last echoes of battle faded, the caves revealed themselves not as fortresses, but as tombs. And in the days to come, those tombs would grow darker still, leading the soldiers deeper into the kind of horror no rifle could prepare them for. The caves of Saipan soon earned a name among the Marines, the Battle of the Caves. It was a phrase that carried not only fear of combat, but dread of what lay inside. Each cavern was a world of shadows, each tunnel a place where hope had died. Some caves erupted in sudden violence, bullets flashing from hidden slits, bayonets stabbing from the dark. Flamethrowers answered with roaring streams of fire, explosions thundered, shaking the ground. But when silence returned, the soldiers found something worse than ambushes. They found scenes that no training manual could have prepared them for. In one cave, they discovered an entire family seated together as if for a final meal. A grandmother leaned against the wall, hands folded in prayer. A father still held a grenade in his lap, his face twisted in agony. A mother had bound an infant to her back, both of them burned beyond recognition. It looked as if they had chosen to leave the world together rather than face capture. Another cavern revealed bodies scattered by an explosion. Shards of metal and bone littered the floor. Nearby lay a broken bottle, its label written in Japanese. Interpreters explained it was poison, handed out to civilians with instructions to use it before Americans arrived. The Marines who saw it stood in stunned silence. They had expected enemies. Instead, they saw victims of fear. The silence was haunting. In some caves, there were no gunshots, no screams, only stillness. Soldiers described how every drip of water echoed like a gunshot. Every pebble shifting underfoot made them flinch. The silence was worse than combat because it carried weight, the weight of hundreds of lives extinguished without a sound. And then there were survivors. In one cavern, a faint sob was heard beneath a pile of rubble. Marines dug with their hands until they uncovered a child, barely alive, clutching a broken doll. The little girl's wide eyes stared at them, uncomprehending, too weak to cry. One soldier wrote that her tiny hands left a scar deeper than any wound he had ever received in battle. Elsewhere, they found a wounded grandmother whispering prayers in Japanese, her voice trembling, her breath shallow. She was too frail to lift her head, yet her lips moved in a rhythm of faith even as her life ebbed away. To the Marines, these moments shattered the notion of victory. They realized that they were no longer fighting soldiers, they were walking through tombs. The psychological toll was immense. Hardened combat veterans, men who had endured the fury of machine gun fire and the terror of artillery, broke down in tears inside the caves. Some trembled uncontrollably, others whispered that the smell of burned flesh would never leave their uniforms. More than one admitted they began to fear cave duty more than the battlefield itself. One diary entry captured it in brutal simplicity. In these caves, victory feels like murder. The words spread among the men, unspoken but understood. Saipan was not a triumph, it was a descent into despair. What haunted the soldiers most was the realization that these deaths were not the result of direct combat. They were the product of years of propaganda. Japanese civilians had been told that surrender meant torture, that American soldiers were monsters who would mutilate children and humiliate women. Convinced of this fate, families chose suicide as an act of honor and protection. The Marines, standing among the bodies, understood the power of lies more vividly than ever before. As the days passed, cave after cave told the same story. Families clutched each other in death. Mothers cradled their babies as if shielding them from the inevitable. Fathers held children's hands, their grip unbroken even after life had left them. The caves were not fortresses, they were graves built of fear. And for the men who entered them, those images never faded. Long after the war, many confessed that it was not the roar of artillery or the charge of enemy soldiers that haunted them most. It was the sight of lifeless children in their mothers' arms. It was the silence of families who had chosen death over hope. The caves of Saipan were not simply battlefields. They were mirrors, forcing soldiers to confront the darkest truth of war, that propaganda and fear could kill just as surely as bullets, and that sometimes the deepest wounds were not in the body but in the soul. By early July, the American advance had pushed the Japanese defenders to the northern tip of Saipan. There, towering cliffs overlooked the Pacific, sheer walls of stone, where the land seemed to end in a sudden plunge into the sea. For many civilians, these cliffs became the last refuge and the final stage of their tragedy. As Marines approached, they heard cries carried on the wind. Families streamed toward the edge of the cliffs, some dressed in white garments as if for a ritual. Mothers clutched infants to their chests. Fathers held the hands of wives and children. The Americans shouted through interpreters, "Do not be afraid. We will not harm you. Surrender means life, not death." But their words could not pierce the wall of fear that propaganda had built. Japanese officers urged the civilians forward, warning that capture would mean humiliation, torture, and slaughter. Pistols were raised, grenades handed out, and in moments the cliffs became a scene of unimaginable despair. One by one, families leapt, Mothers embraced their infants tightly as they hurled themselves into the void. Fathers followed, dragging their loved ones by the hand. Some clutched grenades to their chests, detonating in midair, their remains raining into the waves below. The sea foamed red, littered with broken bodies against jagged rocks. Soldiers who witnessed it described being rooted to the ground, their rifles lowered, powerless to intervene. A Marine later recalled the horror. It was not war. It was despair incarnate. Men wept openly, begging the civilians to stop, but their voices were drowned by the cries of those choosing death. Some soldiers broke down entirely, collapsing to their knees as they watched entire families vanish into the sea. The cliffs earned names that endure to this day: Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. To stand at their edge was to feel history's weight, where thousands chose death rather than surrender. Veterans later admitted that this scene haunted them far more than any firefight. The sight of mothers and children disappearing into the waves became a memory no victory parade could erase. Even decades later, survivors who had been pulled back from the brink described the fear that drove them. One woman remembered an officer screaming at her family, "Jump or be tortured alive." Convinced it was mercy, they moved toward the edge. She was stopped only when a Marine dragged her back, tears streaming down his face as he pleaded in broken Japanese, "Live, please live." For the Americans, Saipan was no longer a battlefield. It was a descent into human tragedy so complete that victory itself felt hollow. They had come to conquer, but what they found was despair. Despair so deep it drowned in the sea and still echoes along the cliffs today. The Marines who survived Saipan would never forget those cliffs. Some tried desperately to intervene, running forward with arms outstretched, only to arrive too late. Others fired warning shots into the air, not at the civilians, but in a desperate attempt to halt the tide of suicides. Nothing worked. Fear was too deeply rooted. Chaplain reports from the ETA. Battlefield tell of soldiers who came to them trembling, whispering confessions that they could still hear screams at night. Men asked if God could forgive them for not being able to save more lives. One chaplain wrote, "Their hearts were broken not by bullets, but by helplessness." Among the chaos, a few acts of mercy stood out. Marines risked their own lives to climb down rocky faces, pulling survivors from the waves. They wrapped them in blankets, offered water, and tried to assure them that surrender meant safety. Some children, dazed and half-drowned, clung to their rescuers with eyes too wide for their age. In those small rescues, soldiers felt both relief and crushing sorrow. For every life saved, dozens more had vanished into the sea. For the local people of Saipan, the cliffs became sacred ground. Survivors later returned with flowers, scattering them into the waves to honor those who never came back. They whispered prayers into the wind, believing the voices of the lost still lingered in the salt air. To this day, visitors describe feeling a chill at Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, as if the land itself remembers. In the memory of veterans, those cliffs stood as proof that propaganda could wield a power deadlier than any weapon. They had faced artillery, grenades, and bayonets, but it was the sight of mothers and children leaping to their deaths that scarred them most deeply. It was despair beyond the battlefield, despair that turned victory into grief. When the guns finally fell silent on Saipan, the island did not feel liberated. It felt haunted. The official date of victory was July 9, 1944, but for the men who survived, the word victory rang hollow. They had seen more than enemy soldiers fall. They had watched families vanish into fire and sea. They had carried children from caves where their parents lay dead. They had walked through silence so heavy that even decades later it followed them home. For the Americans, Saipan marked a turning point. It was not only a strategic triumph that brought bombers within reach of Japan. It was the moment when the war revealed its darkest face. This was no longer soldier against soldier. This was propaganda against humanity, fear against hope, lies against life itself. The Marines and soldiers realized that the cost of war was not measured only in battles won, but in innocence lost. Many who fought there carried invisible scars for the rest of their lives. Some trembled when hearing a baby cry, Haunted by memories of infants they found lifeless in caves. Others confessed they could no longer look at their own families the same way, because Saipan had shown them the unimaginable, that parents could be driven to kill their own children out of fear. Chaplains wrote of men who came to them unable to sleep, whispering that they could still hear screams in the dark. Saipan had broken them in ways bullets never could. For the people of Saipan, the scars were carved into the land itself. The caves became tombs. Survivors returned to leave flowers at their entrances, prayers carried into the dark where their loved ones had perished. The cliffs became sacred sites, where even today memorials rise to honor both Japanese and American dead. Tourists who visit speak of a silence that seems alive, a silence that carries the weight of history's sorrow. Even after the island was declared secure, Saipan's story did not end. For months, and in some cases years, Japanese soldiers continued to hide in the caves, refusing to surrender. Captain Oba, known as the Fox of Saipan, led holdouts for over 500 days, vanishing into the jungle, sustaining themselves in darkness long after the war had passed them by. For Americans stationed there, it meant the war's shadow never lifted. Saipan remained a place where ghosts walked, both living and dead. The legacy of Saipan forces us to confront the darkest truth of war, that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with weapons, but with fear. The civilians who leapt from the cliffs or died in the caves did not fall because of enemy bullets. They fell because they believed a lie. And that lie, nurtured by propaganda, killed thousands more effectively than any artillery shell. World War II was filled with battles remembered for their strategy, their bravery, and their sacrifice. But Saipan stands apart not only for its military significance, but for the human tragedy that unfolded there. World War II was not just fought on beaches and fields, it was fought in the hearts of civilians who were convinced death was preferable to surrender. And in Saipan, World War II left a scar that reminds us of the cost of deception, the cost of fear, the cost of silence. Today, when we look upon those cliffs and caves, we are reminded that the deepest wounds of war are not in the body, but in the soul. They do not heal with treaties or fade with time. They remain, echoing through generations, whispering from stone and sea, never again. And so, Saipan teaches us that victory without humanity is no victory at all, that peace must be guarded, truth must be defended, and history must be remembered, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning carved into the earth itself. The story of Saipan is not only about the past, it is a mirror held up to the present. It reminds us that the greatest danger in any war is not always the enemy's weapons, but the stories we tell, the lies we believe, and the fears we allow to take root. On Saipan, fear was planted so deeply that it drove mothers to leap from cliffs and fathers to embrace death with their children. That is the legacy of unchecked propaganda, of leaders who valued obedience over life itself. For the veterans, the weight of Saipan never lifted. Some returned home to parades and medals, yet inside they carried the cries of children they could not save. Families of those veterans often spoke of nights when their loved ones awoke drenched in sweat, haunted by memories they could not put into words. Many of them chose silence, carrying their grief alone, because how could they describe to others the sight of entire families burned alive in caves or plunging into the ocean together? Saipan also changed how the world viewed war. Historians note that it was one of the first moments when American forces confronted the full scale of civilian involvement in the Pacific theater. It shattered the illusion that war could ever be contained to soldiers alone. Civilians were not bystanders, they were victims, manipulated into tragedy by leaders who told them surrender was dishonor. In that sense, Saipan was not only a battlefield, but a revelation. Today, when visitors stand at Suicide Cliff or peer into the dark mouths of Saipan's caves, they are standing at a place where history itself mourns. Flowers left by survivors still scatter across the rocks. Tourists speak in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the silence. Local children are taught to honor the spirits who remain, to remember that the cost of fear and hatred is written into the very stones of their island. If Saipan teaches us anything, it is that peace cannot be taken for granted. It must be built carefully, protected fiercely, and nourished with truth. Because the moment lies are allowed to fester, the moment fear is allowed to rule, humanity walks once more toward the edge of the cliff. And so the island of Saipan stands as a monument, not to victory, not to conquest, but to the fragile line between life and despair. It calls to us across the decades, urging us never to forget, never to repeat, and always to choose truth over fear, peace over war, and life over silence.